Now, if the figures are to be believed, nowhere else in the world is extreme poverty felt more sharply or in greater numbers than here in Nigeria. Daily, the drive towards economic growth comes into visible conflict with the survival needs of tens of millions of the dispossessed. And oftentimes it seems that the two can never add up, because each year the number of people who live in extreme poverty in Nigeria just seems to keep going up, not down, along with a ballooning population. And that's something that any incoming government will need to confront head on, along with increasing urbanization driven by an almost unquenchable thirst for jobs and modern living. It's a world of galloping scarcity, which, if unchecked, could degenerate into an even greater epidemic of insufficiency, which in turn could lead to a national convulsion. How extraordinary is it that Nigeria used to be, in terms of prospects, one of the most prosperous in Africa and indeed the world. But today, the tree that used to be this country seems to have stopped bearing fruit, and more than 130 million of its people are in despair. How should a new government deal with one of the most pressing issues of our time, the brutality and unforgivability of extreme poverty? Well, for more on this, I'll be joined in the studio by Stanley Achonu, the Nigerian country director of the One Campaign, a global movement campaigning to end extreme poverty. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles, for having me.
Give us a sense of the scope and scale of extreme poverty in Nigeria.
Government data, let's start from government data. It says 133 million Nigerians live in extreme poverty. Just need to imagine what 1 million people is and then multiply it into 133. Everywhere you turn, a greater number of the Nigerians you meet live in extreme poverty. That's what it means. If our population is 200 million, 133 live in extreme poverty. Is a scary number.
It is.
Even if you live in a highbrow area, the data shows that almost everyone around you lives in extreme poverty, and it's not hidden. It's not something that is unseen. It stares us in the face, even if we try to ignore it. Is in our everyday encounter. Is in the public transport. Is in our schools. Is in everything we do. Is in our churches. Is in our mosques. Everywhere you turn, poverty stares us in the face. Is in our families, and a quick test of how bad it is for our families is how many of your relatives call you these days, even those that didn't used to call you. How many of them are now calling you to ask for help, to solve basic problems? Because again, we think of this challenge as just being monetary poverty. Multidimensionally, 133 million poor Nigerians means that they have no access to basic education. They have no access to primary health care service. They have no access to jobs and opportunities. So the challenge is enormous. It's not just monetary problem, because when we think of poverty, we think it is just ability to have money in our account or in our pocket. It is about our ability to feed ourselves and feed our families. And 133 million of us literally go to bed unsure of what will happen tomorrow. That's a scary number.
I have to say, listening to you put it in such stark terms, it is frightening. And you have to wonder, maybe it's that fright that makes governments sort of run away. But in the context of what you've just told us, what would be the first order of business in tackling poverty in the medium to long term for a government coming in? Would it be stimulating economic growth and getting Nigeria to produce enough food for domestic consumption so that prices become cheaper and more food becomes more widely available to people who are poorer? I mean, it's sort of a, I suppose, short, medium and long-term sort of plan.
I wish there was one way out of it that we can face this today. But the problem I've described to you shows that we are literally in danger, right? So every single thing that is on the table must be given equal attention. There is no, this is one priority. And the challenge is that oftentimes we think that throwing money at this problem will make the problem go away without addressing the root cause, right? Yes, we need to produce more food. We need food security. It will help in the immediate. Yes, we need to do things like conditional cash transfer. We need to put money into the pockets of the extreme poor, right? Attaching relevant conditions that make it a long term. The challenge with what we have done in the last 8 years is that we have implemented conditional cash transfer without actually pursuing the conditions. And I think that from the first day, this government needs a better understanding of what the problem is, because that will help. And I can go give you a long list of every attempt since the 1970s made by various governments with fancy names, right? But nobody has gone back to say what went wrong. And that's our inability or outright refusal to learn lessons from what we have done is why it seems like throwing money at the problem will solve it. No, throwing money won't solve it. So I have a few ideas of what the government can do, and these are things that have worked elsewhere. You can look to India. India supported the growth of medium and small scale businesses, right? Over the years, what we have seen in India is that those small businesses now serve as feeder into the larger industries, right? And they employ people, and that has led to growth in India. And those small and medium scale businesses export more than 5,000 products out of India because they've met market expectation in India, and they are now attending to the rest of the world. What that has meant is that more people have gone into employment, which is sustainable, because a lot of times we treat poverty alleviation as a government problem, and that must be tackled by government. That is not the only way out. Just enabling Nigerians to create opportunities for Nigerians is one way to tackle the problem, right? That's one. Another example from India is basic health care. Nigerians pay the highest amount out of pocket for basic health care. This is not even your secondary and tertiary health requirement. I'm talking about things like treating malaria and immunization and all of that. The cost is exorbitant for the extremely poor. So simply putting in place health insurance for the extreme poor as a condition for cash transfer, we now bring more people into the health system and sort of save them that cost. For me and you, malaria medicine of 2,000 naira will mean nothing, right? There are families that have to make life and death decision over buying 2,000 naira malaria medicine versus just going sick till they die. You can look to Vietnam. Vietnam deliberately created large-scale industrialization, attracted manufacturing on a large scale. Poverty rate in Vietnam went from 75% to 3% by 2020, right? So, and the growth has remained consistent because people found sustainable means of livelihood. They were lifted out of poverty. You can turn to China. I can give you examples. China deliberately invested in the rural areas. Income in rural areas was deliberately spruced up so that urban migration will reduce and quality of life in the rural areas will grow. 850 million people were lifted out of poverty in China. So our problem is not insurmountable. The examples exist. But why has, and all of the examples I've given you, government has tried it here. So the question is, why has it failed? And it comes back to what I said, that we are a people that refuse to learn lessons. And I hope that that will change, that the new government will start from saying, we have done this in the past. Let's start with evaluating what worked, what failed, why did it work, why did it fail? Right. What can we do differently?
Well, I haven't got the government in front of me. I've got you, and you, I presume, has done some evaluation. So let me get your take on Mr. Tinubus Manifesto. He, according to that document, he intends to fight poverty by boosting agriculture, stimulating economic growth, creating sufficient jobs with decent wages. I mean, granted, it doesn't say how he's going to do it, but broadly speaking, is that a reasonably good way to make a dent on poverty?
It sounds like the examples I've given. It sounds like what has happened in Vietnam, what has happened in India. But and I'm sure that when you look at the outgoing government, whichever version of the manifesto you look at, these were identical. You know, they are there. It goes back to our approach to it, our sincerity to it, because and I'm sure that when you subject the programs and activities and policies of the outgoing government, you will see on paper that attempt was made to stimulate the economy. You will see on paper that effort was made to create industry, support small and medium scale industries. But what was missing is leadership, right? And I say leadership not because we tend to think of this challenge as a presidential challenge. Yes, the president plays a critical role, provides the leadership that flows down, both for his ministerial level appointees, but leadership for governors who have direct responsibility for some of these issues, right? Because it has to be a shared vision. The shared vision to tackle poverty does not exist. It didn't exist in the last 8 years, and if this government does not make it a priority, that shared vision will not exist. What will happen? What happens without shared vision is that you can stay here in Abuja, make all of those fancy policies on paper, but implementation requires that you mobilize the leadership at state level, at local government level, so that everybody puts their eyes on that single goal, irrespective of political affiliation, irrespective of your role in government, that we have a single goal to say, look, it is a big shame that a country well endowed, well resourced, can wallow in this level of poverty. It has to be a shared vision.
That's a very good point.
He has to show the leadership. And it's not about what has been written in the manifesto. Previous manifestos had it. What was missing is that shared vision. And except he stands in front and shows that leadership, we'll be back here in 8 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's also important to note that the governors have often complained of not having enough money. A lot of the allocations they get, which first of all is a completely wrong model for funding your projects. I mean, you've got to have your own internally generated revenue, but most of the money they get, they claim they use it to pay salaries and all the rest of it, and there's never really enough to do anything else. The bureaucracy is too large, the government bureaucracy. I mean, there's just not enough to deal with things like, education, for example, which is a way of tackling poverty. Tinubu has said that he would train and give economic opportunity to the poorest and most vulnerable in Nigeria. As you said, on paper, that sounds like a very good proposal, but it's got to be funded. And in order for that to be funded, as you said, there's got to be this buy-in from the states and the local governments, and there has to be the availability of cash on a recurring basis in order to fund that. I mean, do you have any thoughts in that direction? I mean, it just sounds like a monumental problem, and it just keeps getting worse every year.
Yeah, the states will always complain about money. It's always about the resources are never enough.
Yeah, but that's why I said that fundamentally, the way they get their money has to be, they've got to be given more resource control and things like that in order for the model to change. You see what I mean? But conditional on them doing certain things.
Yes. So what is obvious from this lack of resources, also the same question about lack of leadership. The states have become very lazy, and I have to answer this question in two parts. They have become lazy in creating the opportunities to raise the required finances in-house.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So yeah. that is just a simple case of laziness. But the other part I want us to look at is when we say that the available resource is not enough. It raises the question, what are we spending the available resource on? Right.
And it raises the question about corruption, doesn't it?
And of course, there is a straight line between the level of corruption that we have and the extreme poverty that we have. Because, again, because we do not have a shared vision, it is easy for a governor to, invest in fancy projects, something to be remembered for, not for lifting people out of poverty. And I'll ask you this. When you look at, and there are several federal government intervention programs. Let's look at SUBEB, right? The Universal Basic Education, which sort of, there is a federal government grant that requires counterpart funding, right? At the moment, the states are failing to provide their counterpart funding in order to assess that, in order to invest in basic primary education, right? The same applies to basic healthcare provision fund. So just simply meeting the requirements, and when you hear requirements, it's not even counterpart funding. It is things like open a bank account for primary health centers in your state so that federal government can credit money to them. Does that require resources? Look, anyone who wants to make excuse for not doing their job will make excuse, including saying the money is not available. But we have also seen people that have made considerable dent on simple things like education and primary health care. Those investments, things like, putting conditions for families to send their kids to school, providing meals at school, attract families to bring their children to school. They have long-lasting impact on the life of those kids. So there are several things you can do that doesn't require multi-billion naira investment.
I understand what you mean. I know you gave examples of things like, you use sort of China and Vietnam and so on, but do you think the Nigerian situation is kind of unique to this country? Never mind the historical problem. I mean, well, you have to mind it, obviously, but the historical problem has led us to where we are today. And you've got things like, generating electricity, for example, which the Chinese probably didn't have a problem with. But, generating electricity as a way of fighting poverty. I mean, that's an essential thing, isn't it?
So, of course, we have energy poverty as well. Is a big challenge if people do not have access, not just access in our homes, but because if you think of industrialization, large-scale manufacturing that creates opportunity for the poor, you need to have stable electricity, right? South Africa is facing a downturn because,
because of the problems it has with the electricity.
So it's a big problem. And there are specific things the government can do. Things like on the high scale that doesn't look like it's a direct challenge to tackling poverty. Are things like investing in public transportation, investing in rural infrastructure.
So those are low-hanging fruits.
Those are things you can do very quickly,
that can
right?
Be seen.
But then there is also a long-term challenge, which goes back to getting everybody on the same table and saying, look, we all have to do this. Things like investing long-term in our primary education, training our teachers, paying our health workers well. They are some of the worst paid, and as you have seen.
Well, the interesting thing is that in Mr. Tinubus Manifesto, all these things that you're saying are there. He also talked about providing conditional income support to very poor households in return for the recipients being required to meet goals like school attendance, that kind of thing.
Showing up in hospitals
and then he also talks about providing unconditional support, because you got the conditional and then unconditional support for the elderly, those who are sort of extremely poor, as well as physically challenged people. It all sounds very good.
It sounds like whoever put the document together has like a good understanding of what the issue is.
Yeah, well, it certainly sounds like there is awareness there, which is a crucial starting point.
No doubt. That awareness has to be backed with now clear understanding. So the difference between what has happened here and what has happened in the countries I mentioned, India, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and all of those places, is that they didn't allow their problem to become cancerous like ours. Ours is almost cancerous, and cancer requires sort of like some level of dedicated treatment.
Absolutely.
Right? This is what is missing. We have allowed our problem to become cancerous, yet we are treating it as if we have headache and fever. It's not that. If you have cancer, you have to make sure you show up when the doctor needs you to show up in the hospital. That is what this government needs to do. The document you refer to shows that somebody understands that while you put condition for some people to say, for you to get 5,000 naira monthly, you must make sure that your kids show up in school, or you must show up at health centers for medical tests and evaluation to make sure that you are healthy, right? Those conditions exist. There are also those who you do not need to put conditions on. And in communities where some people will not meet the requirements for conditional cash transfer, you need to also make sure, because once you leave some people behind, it immediately creates imbalance and worsens the situation. So there is obviously clear understanding of what the problem is. What I cannot vouch for is if this understanding of the issue exists only while they are outside of government, because it seems like,
yes,
for lack of better word, they take leave of their senses once they get into government, because someone understands that.
So it's the discipline of implementation.
Exactly.
Yeah, there needs to be a discipline that goes with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. And all these things that we talked about, as you said, would just be stuff on paper, particularly things like corruption, for example, or actually making a difference with things like electricity and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a much bigger problem in itself, isn't it?
And I fear that there is a chance that the government will sort of jump right in and create a fresh program, right? The problem with creating a fresh program without understanding what has gone wrong is that you're only going to create a variation of what is already being done. We used to have Shopee, you win, and all of that. A variation of that, a step down of that is Empower, conditional cash transfer, and all of that. If you try, and I'm just saying about the most recent of these programs, and I'm sure as you go further than DFree, FIP, and all of those things, they all sound similar. The only thing is that you're only going to just new name, no new solution. But what will be really impactful is, can we start with an evaluation of existing program, the current one being implemented by the same APC government? Can we say what has worked, right? What has failed, and then take it from there? I fear that the challenge with the current program is, I don't want to use the word capture. It feels like those charged with solving this problem have sort of treated this as an opportunity to solve their personal problem. They haven't sort of gone all out. There is need for greater transparency and accountability in how we have managed this process. It goes back to what you talked about, corruption. There's a straight line between the two of them. Program effectiveness, once you mix corruption into it, you start to see mixed results. And that is one challenge they need to look into before they start anything. Well,
let's talk about this again a few months from now and see what they're actually doing, because he did say that he intended to hit the ground running. So let's see how that goes. But I want to thank you very much indeed. Stanley Achonu is a Nigeria country director of the One Campaign, which is a global movement campaigning to end extreme poverty. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles.